find ourselves this morning in a narrow time window which lasts less than 6 weeks each year, which might be described as patriotism season, with Memorial Day having been celebrated just last Monday, and Flag Day coming up in less than 2 weeks, and Independence Day following close on its heels less than 3 weeks later. This is the time of year when God Bless America takes center stage at the seventh inning stretch during baseball games. And mattress companies air commercials on television which tout the red, white, and blue as much as they tout a good night's sleep. And TV specials on public broadcasting feature programs about the national parks, or stories about the great wars of the Civil War, or World Wars I or II, or Vietnam. This is indeed patriotism season. Now, Americans may hold varying opinions on lots of different issues in our country today, and on what constitutes true patriotism. But one thing which we all seem to hold near and dear is an unwavering respect for freedom. Whether it be the American Civil Liberties Union on one side of the political spectrum, championing the cause of the First Amendment protection of the freedom of speech, or the National Rifle Association on the other end of that same political spectrum, championing the right to keep and bear arms, freedom is one of those basic American qualities, basic human qualities, I really believe, that everyone wants to get behind and support. Well, let me take you back in time just a few years. The year was 1943. Some of you remember it. It was a good year, some people are saying. It may have been a good year for you, but our country and the world was at the height, or perhaps I might say the depth, of World War II. It was in February and March of that year, 1943, that the Saturday Evening Post ran on its cover perhaps the most famous series of illustrations by America's most famous illustrators. Norman Rockwell's Four Freedoms, inspired by President Franklin Roosevelt's 1941 State of the Union address, went to the heart in Rockwell's characteristically idyllic way of this deep human longing for true freedom. Some of you may remember some of those images. There is freedom of speech. Freedom of religion. Freedom from want. And freedom from fear. The four freedoms. Freedom. That's really what lies at the heart of today's first reading from the book of Acts, which features Paul and Silas in Philippi. Now, if you've been paying attention for 7 Sundays in a row now, our first reading each week has always come from that book, the book of Acts, as it has laid out before us the travels and the travails of those first disciples as they spread the good news throughout the not always so receptive world around them. Today, with the arrival of Paul and Silas in Philippi, in ancient Macedonia, what is now present-day Greece, we witness for the first time the gospel message being carried from the Middle East on to the continent of Europe. And like so many stories in the book of Acts, this one is filled with suspense and danger and unexpected twists. It all started like a day as had so many days before it. Paul and Silas were on their way to worship, as was their custom. Apparently, though, there was a slave woman of Philippi who had been following them around for some days now. This woman, using the language of the Scriptures, was possessed by a spirit of divination. In other words, she was a fortune teller. And her particular gift brought her owners a great deal of money. This woman, this slave woman, would trail behind Paul and Silas, calling out, "These men are slaves, slaves of the Most High God, who proclaim to you a way of salvation." Which, if you ask me, sounds like a pretty good advertising technique if you're trying to get your message out to a whole new community. Paul, however, saw her as more than simply a source of free publicity. Paul saw her as a woman who was trapped in a different kind of slavery. Not just a slave to her owners, but also in bondage to this spirit which resided within her. And so he ordered that spirit to come out. He performed an exorcism, if you will. Now you would think that being freed from some kind of demonic spiritual possession would be a good thing. But apparently this slave woman's owners had another opinion. It seems that freedom is a fine thing, so long as someone else's freedom doesn't have a negative impact on my life. You see, her slavery to the demon which possessed her meant financial gain to her owners. And now her freedom meant financial hardship to them instead. Her freedom from one kind of slavery meant that her value as another kind of slave suddenly vanished. You see, this is where the rubber really hits the road. Whether it's fracking for oil in North Dakota, or overcrowded garment factories in Bangladesh, or making components for our iPhone in China, or growing lettuce in the Central Valley, or working at low-paying jobs in the service industry just to keep the tourists at Disneyland fed and housed and entertained, the issue always remains the same. You see, we are quick to champion the freedom of others, unless that freedom means higher costs to heat or cool our homes, or more expensive tennis shoes, or higher prices for the fresh produce in the grocery store, or a bigger bill at the gas tank, or more expensive diamonds in the jewelry store. Now, as then, when one person's freedom runs into someone else's pocketbook, freedom usually comes out the loser. So, what did the owners of that slave woman do? Well, they hauled Paul and Silas off to court for disturbing the peace. And the local Chamber of Commerce was quick to rally around their fellow small business owners and demand that those two outsiders, those two foreigners, be tossed into the clink. So, now the economic prejudice of the slave owners was cloaked in the guise of nationalistic pride, of civic duty. Keep that foreign competition, those foreign workers, those people who worship a foreign god out of our marketplace and off of our soil. It sounds all too familiar, doesn't it? Some stories, it seems, find a way of just repeating themselves over and over and over once again. And so the local mob got its way. The next scene in our little drama finds Paul and Silas deep in the innermost cell of the local jail, with their backs bloodied by a flogging and their feet shackled in chains. Despite their ordeal, however, they are found leading a mini revival right there in their jail cell, singing songs and leading prayers among the prisoners. It's about midnight when a divinely inspired earthquake strikes. For a change, this is a natural disaster which truly is an act of God. And the prison doors spring open, and the prison chains fall from the feet of the captives. When the jailer who had pulled the graveyard shift that night woke up, apparently he had been sleeping on the job, and sees that the earthquake has sprung all of the prison doors wide open, he is convinced that all of his charges have fled into the night. And being the honorable civil servant that he is, not to mention the fact that he may be fearing the punishment which awaits him for being delinquent in his duties, he prepares to take his own life. But Paul calls out from the darkest depths of the prison, "Do not harm yourself, for we are all here." All of the prisoners, despite the opportunity to walk through the open door, have chosen to remain in their places. This witness of Paul and Silas becomes the opportunity for the jailer to turn his life around and to follow this Jesus Christ whom Paul and Silas have been proclaiming. The irony, of course, in this morning's reading is that there is freedom, and then there is freedom. You know, the people who seem to be most in bondage in this story, whether it be the slave woman or whether it be Paul and Silas while they're in prison, the people who seem to be most in bondage are those who find freedom. And yet, despite their newfound freedom, they still remain as slaves and prisoners. And those people who in the story who seem to be most free, the slave owners, the city judges, the angry denizens of the public square, the local jailer, well, they're the ones who really seem to be held by some kind of inner slavery which simply won't release them. Freedom, you see, is not a zero-sum game. It's not as though someone else's freedom means that there's less freedom for the rest of us to enjoy. Nevertheless, so many people seem to believe otherwise. So my question to you this morning, what is it that is preventing you from becoming truly free? And what is it that is holding you back from embracing and from welcoming others to embrace that kind of freedom which just lies at our doorstep, waiting to be invited in? The freedom which comes through the gospel life isn't necessarily a freedom which will guarantee us wealth or success or public prestige or independence. And by the same token, those who show signs of the greatest wealth or success or prestige or independence in our society today are often the same people who are bound by some kind of invisible chains. No, the freedom of the gospel isn't freedom from anything. It is a freedom to. It is a freedom to act, a freedom to serve, a freedom to be the one whom God is truly calling you to become. Often it is a freedom which invites you to step away from the very things which many of us count as being so freeing, and to step instead into a relationship with a loving God. So this morning, be free. In the midst of life, as you find it right at this moment, be free. Accept that gift of freedom which God offers to each one of us this morning. And accept the giver, in whose life there is perfect freedom. Amen.